strange studies of strange stories.
No one would have believed in the last years of the 19th century that this world was being watched, keenly and closely, by intelligences greater than man's and yet as mortal as his own. That, as men busied themselves about their various concerns, they were scrutinized and studied, perhaps almost as narrowly as a man with a microscope might scrutinize the transient creatures that swarm and multiply in a drop of water. With infinite complacency, men went to and fro over this globe about their little affairs, serene in their assurance of their empire over matter. It is possible that the infusoria under the microscope do the same. No one gave a thought to the older worlds of space as sources of human danger, or thought of them only to dismiss the idea of life upon them as impossible or improbable. It is curious to recall some of the mental habits of those departed days. At most, terrestrial men fancied there might be other men upon Mars, perhaps inferior to themselves, and ready to welcome a missionary enterprise. Yet, across the gulf of space, minds that are to our minds as ours are to those of the beasts that perish, intellects vast and cool and unsympathetic, regarded this earth with envious eyes, and slowly and surely drew their plans against us. And early in the 20th century came the Great Disillusionment.
That is the opening of the H.G. Wells classic, The War of the Worlds. And man, does it come in with a bang! I'm hooked! So hooked, I'm gonna make us spend the whole month on this amazing novel. And I don't care what you say.
No argument for me. I love this book, and I'm ready to scrutinize it keenly and closely here with you on Strange Studies of Strange Stories. I'm Chad Pfeiffer.
And I'm Chris Lackey. Welcome to our free show for June.
It's a summer blockbuster on The War of the Worlds that will be running all month. Make sure to subscribe on Patreon to get all of the coverage. Who is that reader?
That was Greg Johnson. Go over to his Patreon page and check out all the cool stuff he's making. Recently, Greg was commissioned to make gaming miniature terrain, specifically light up Lovecraftian gaming terrain. I can't wait to see it.
Well, you'll have to go into a dark room with Greg to see it, if you're ready to do that.
Oh, I'm ready. You can always follow him for free on Patreon. For just $3 a month, you can get bonus videos, work in progress stuff, polls, and digital downloads.
You know, Greg said he wanted to read on these episodes because he really loves this book.
Yeah.
Although I suspect that what he really wants is to start a panic, like the Orson Welles adaptation did in 1938.
Ah, yes.
I kind of suspect it because once Greg and I were having breakfast together, it was early morning, kind of quietly staring out the cafe window, not talking, and then just out of nowhere he blurted out, "God, I'd love to start a panic." It's weird. Anyway, I didn't say anything. This was years ago. Greg won't remember it if you ask him about it. But thank you, Greg.
The War of the Worlds was first published in 1898, but this story takes place a few years after that, making it a near-future setting. This is the last of the big four H.G. Wells novels for us to discuss. The Time Machine came out in 1895, The Island of Dr. Moreau in 96, The Invisible Man in 97, and I can't believe this guy, 98, The War of the Worlds. Bam, 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 bam.
That's 4 bams. We've covered them all on the show, and there's an H.G. Wells collection on our Patreon page that you can use to find those episodes. Speaking of Greg's gaming terrain, I also recently learned that Wells is one of the fathers of miniature wargaming.
Yes.
He wrote the book Little Wars in 1913, which had rules for basically playing with toy soldiers on the floor. There's lots of seductive illustrations of H.G. Wells on the floor with his toys. It's probably the first civilian rule book for such a thing, which is such a huge pastime now. I'm thinking about the Games Workshop stores everywhere. And
oh, yeah.
He also wrote a prophetic military science fiction novel called The War in the Air in 1907. Although, like a lot of authors who write books about war, the man was by all accounts a pacifist.
We'll talk more about Wells and this novel's background as we go along this month, but I want to get right into the story.
The War of the Worlds is separated into 2 books. By the way, many of the adaptations drop the and call it War of the Worlds. The Spielberg movie is called War of the Worlds, but this book is called The War of the Worlds. Book 1 is called The Coming of the Martians.
And Chapter 1 is titled The Eve of War. The narrator is recounting his experience of living through the Martian invasion. He establishes that the Martians have been watching Earth since the mid-1800s. Humans would have thought that this idea is preposterous, as Mars was considered lifeless. The Martians, however, are technologically advanced and see humans only as animals. Mars is an old planet that is smaller than Earth. It's running out of resources and it's looking for greener pastures.
We know in our present day that Mars is in fact a dead planet because we have robots on there driving around and taking photos.
Yep.
In fact, we talked to one of those spacecraft operators on one of our bonus episodes.
We did.
We can link out to from 2021. But at some point in the distant past, they do think there was atmosphere on Mars, and part of the current mission is looking for remnants of life from then, or possibly current microbial life. Wells is getting some of it right that Mars had a start before Earth, but in this version, there was no dissipation of atmosphere. It continued to develop concurrent with Earth. And like the Neoterics in Microscopic God from earlier this year, the book says the immediate pressure of necessity had brightened Martian intellects, enlarged their powers, and hardened their hearts. We get this overview and then we track back 6 years when some incandescent gas is observed breaking out from Mars. And to this narrator's mind, that was the start of things. Although it says during this time he was working on some writing, he was busy about learning to ride a bike. He wouldn't have even known that this kind of stuff was happening with Mars if he hadn't met an astronomer named Ogilvy, whom he started hanging out with.
Ogilvy had an observatory outside of Ottershaw, about an hour southwest of London. This book is very keen on locations, many of which I don't know anything about, even though I live in England. At the observatory, Ogilvy and the narrator witnessed Mars venting gas, but didn't realize that they were actually seeing rockets launching to Earth. Everyone on Earth is totally unaware of what's coming.
Once the blurry outline of the larger events is established, it becomes a human-level story. It's demonstrated at the end of the chapter, which is just the narrator taking a walk with his wife. The last line of the chapter is, "It seemed so safe and tranquil."
This bit stood out to me from this chapter.
And before we judge the Martians too harshly, we must remember what ruthless and utter destruction our own species has wrought, not only upon animals such as the vanished bison and the dodo. The Tasmanians were entirely swept out of existence in a war of extermination waged by European immigrants in the space of 50 years. Are we such apostles of mercy as to complain if the Martians warred in the same spirit?
One of the many ideas presented in this book. You think Martians are bad? Look in the mirror.
It's in the epigraph that opens the book. But who shall dwell in these worlds if they be inhabited? Are we or they lords of the world? And how are all things made for man? Kepler, quoted in The Anatomy of Melancholy. The Anatomy of Melancholy is a book by Robert Burton from 1621, and in that book it's quoting the famous German astronomer Johannes Kepler, who came up with the laws of planetary motion in the early 1600s.
Oh, wow.
What I'm getting from that epigraph is, humans, get over yourself. It's not all about you. Don't take your superiority for granted. Another thing in this chapter, you paraphrase that they observed rockets being launched toward Earth, which I would say too, but rockets weren't really a thing yet.
Right. You're
It
right.
says,
Yeah.
I am inclined to think that this blaze may have been the casting of the huge gun in the vast pit sunk into their planet from which their shots were fired at us. So it's like a space gun
Right.
that's sending these crafts our direction. Throughout the book, it's described this way. And this was how space travel was done in the 1865 Jules Verne novel, From the Earth to the Moon,
That's
as
right.
well.
Yeah.
So this is something people would have been thinking about. And really, it's not terribly far off from how rockets work, which, it's an explosion controlled in a cylinder. The reasons the rocket is better is they have guidance and the people inside don't get killed the way they might be being blasted out inside the space bullet. But the War of the Worlds was an acknowledged inspiration to Robert Goddard and others who pioneered the rockets that eventually did guide humanity into outer space.
Yeah.
And I do think that some space programs are actually still toying with space gun-like launch systems, so it's not totally crazy. I also really loved the scene in the observatory. I still remember that vigil very distinctly. The black and silent observatory, the shadowed lantern throwing a feeble glow upon the floor, the steady ticking of the clockwork of the telescope, the little slit in the roof, stardust streaked across it. We have that cosmic opening, and then we scope in on this quiet sensory scene. I can almost smell the coffee brewing.
Yeah.
Remember Wells' law that we've discussed before with his other works. There should be ordinary detail alongside one single extraordinary assumption.
Yeah.
Here, the extraordinary assumption is the alien invasion. To make it more effective, it's got to be woven in with aggressively commonplace details like this. The last thing that stood out to me in this chapter is a sentence. It seems to me now almost incredibly wonderful that with the swift fate hanging over us, men could go about their petty concerns as they did. So if the societal theme is get over yourself, I think this is kind of the spiritual theme of the novel. Your time is coming too, and the preparations are already being made. The nurses that will treat you on your deathbed have already been born. So, remember this is being written and published at the end of the 19th century, and they had their own Y2K-like fears going on at that time. There was a widespread anxiety labeled with the French phrase fin du siècle, or end of the age. This was something that people were talking about. There were predictions that an apocalypse would occur at midnight on the last day of 1899.
Oh, right.
And,
yes.
and of course, this being the height of the British Empire, Wells is also expressing anxiety over how long that world domination can last. And I don't think that's subtext. That's pretty much presented solidly in this book.
That gets us into Chapter 2, The Falling Star. People see what is believed to be a meteorite fall over Winchester. Ogilvy goes to the crash site to find a large metal cylinder which has landed in Horsell Common, just outside of Woking, which is about an hour outside of London.
I'm getting this from Christopher Martin's 1988 biography of Wells. In 1895, Wells married Catherine Robbins and moved with her to Woking in Surrey. So he lived in this area that he's writing about. P.S. That's a whole scandal. He had been married to his cousin. Catherine was a student of his he fell in love with.
Right.
They went away together. Topic for another show. But this is where he wrote all of those great novels. It was an incredibly productive time. He spent his mornings walking or cycling in the countryside and his afternoons writing. The original idea for The War of the Worlds came from his brother during one of these walks, pondering on what it might be like if alien beings were suddenly to descend on the scene. I can imagine having that conversation.
Sure.
What would you do? And that's essentially what happens here. The narrator is busy at home writing, and he doesn't even notice the thing fall to the earth that Ogilvy is now investigating.
Ogilvy can't get close to it because of the heat, but he can see the end of the cylinder sticking out of the ground. He witnesses the end of it rotating. He thinks back to what he saw through his telescope, and he's able to put it together, and he also assumes that there are people inside. He runs back to town and starts telling people what's going on, but they just think that he's a nut. He is, however, able to convince Henderson, a London journalist, to go check it out. They run back and find the cylinder has stopped moving, but there is air either entering or escaping at the rim with a thin, sizzling sound. Henderson sends a telegraph to the newspaper. The narrator hears about the cylinder from his newspaper boy. It seems that by 8 o'clock, a number of other boys and unemployed men have headed over to check this thing out.
One thing I loved in this chapter was when the top began to unscrew. That's a terrifying moment.
Yeah.
But Ogilvy assumes there might be humans inside trying to escape, like you said. So he kind of forgets about the heat, and he runs down to the cylinder wanting to join in screwing it open. He wants to help.
Right.
The glowing metal causes him to remember that it's hot, and so he stops before he burns his hands, and that's when he runs away. But it's heartening that his first instinctual reaction is to help.
Let's check out the next chapter on Horsell Common. The narrator arrives at the crash site and finds people already there, standing on the edge of the crater. He sees the table-sized cap is no longer rotating, but notices a yellowish white metal between the cap and the cylinder. He thinks that there are no living beings inside. He makes this assumption. I'm not quite sure why, but maybe alien information, like it's maybe like a message in a bottle type of thing.
It'll be a record with Martian pop songs. I think that's a reasonable assumption.
So he returns home because nothing's really going on. In the evening paper, the narrator reads that they are reporting this is a message from Mars. Henderson, Ogilvy, and the astronomer Royal, Stent, are trying to dig out the cylinder. Ogilvy asks the narrator to contact the landowner to kick all the looky-loos out since they're getting in the way of the excavation. The narrator is stoked to be involved. He's like, I can do something with this. This is cool. So he finds the owner, and he's going to arrive by train soon and goes to meet him at the station.
In the last chapter, we got Ogilvy trying to help, and at the top of this chapter, there are 4 or 5 boys throwing rocks at the cylinder, knocking on the glass at the zoo, essentially. And the narrator has to give them a talking to. Cut that out. In fact, the main reason he's been asked to go talk to the landowner, Lord Hilton, is this massive ornery boys. They need to put up some railing or something to keep them out. So it's this other side of humanity. And there are also some folks who turned up hoping to see a pile of burnt corpses who are disappointed that there's only this big cylinder there. The narrator says extraterrestrial had no meaning for most of the onlookers. And this is Wells introducing the adjective extraterrestrial to mean life beyond Earth for the first time. Remember, we talked about this during Weird Bear Month when we covered L. Sprague de Camp, who took that and applied extraterrestrial as a noun and abbreviated it as ET for the first time. I got a kick out of this bit near the end of the chapter, talking about the crowd around the cylinder. An enterprising sweet stuff dealer had sent up his son with a barrow load of green apples and ginger beer. So that little detail says so much. We got those dual looks at humanity in these chapters, the helpful and the aggressive. But this guy really represents humanity's adaptability. This is H.G. Wells predicting the T-shirt stand.
Chapter 4 does a little summary for us within its title. The cylinder opens. The narrator arrives at the crash site at sunset, and hundreds of people are there creeping and peeping at this thing. Ogilvy keeps yelling at people to get back because they don't know what's in the cylinder. Finally, the end twists off itself, and the narrator stares into the darkness inside of the thing. Gray tentacles, the thickness of a walking stick, emerge from the cylinder.
A big, grayish, rounded bulk, the size perhaps of a bear, was rising slowly and painfully out of the cylinder.
2 large, dark-colored eyes were regarding me steadfastly. The mass that framed them, the head of the thing, was rounded and had, one might say, a face. There was a mouth under the eyes, the lipless brim of which quivered and panted and dropped saliva. The whole creature heaved and pulsated convulsively. A lank, tentacular appendage gripped the edge of the cylinder. Another swayed in the air. Those who have never seen a living Martian can scarcely imagine the strange horror of its appearance. The peculiar V-shaped mouth with its pointed upper lip, the absence of brow ridges, the absence of a chin beneath the wedge-like lower lip, the incessant quivering of this mouth, the gorgon groups of tentacles, the tumultuous breathing of the lungs in a strange atmosphere, the evident heaviness and painfulness of movement due to the greater gravitational energy of the Earth. Above all, the extraordinary intensity of the immense eyes were at once vital, intense, inhuman, crippled, and monstrous. There was something fungoid in the oily brown skin, something in the clumsy deliberation of the tedious movements unspeakably nasty. Even at this first encounter, this first glimpse, I was overcome with disgust and dread.
This thing topples over the brim of the cylinder and plops to the ground, which overcame me with disgust and dread. And then another one starts wriggling its way out. This is some kind of Martian clown cylinder. Unspeakably nasty.
Unspeakably nasty. The narrator gets back and hides in some trees, trying to peep from there. The crowd hightails it out of there as well. However, at the distance that the narrator is at and everybody else, they can't actually see what's going on inside the pit.
It's such a supremely weird encounter. Probably not a lot of precedence for this kind of completely non-human alien life form. Maybe the Zippahoos from 1888, which we've covered before. I can link to that.
All right.
But these are some of literature's OG tentacled monsters appearing here.
Right.
Wells had published an essay on intelligence on Mars in 1896, actually, in which he'd speculated on the nature of Martian life forms and how they may have evolved compared to humans. Those ideas are used almost exactly in this book, although, of course, dramatized to pants effect. Speaking of pure nightmare fuel, let's keep rolling with Chapter 5, The Heat Ray.
Yeah. Out of the pit arises a thin rod with a disc-like mirror at the end. Since it's getting dark, the narrator can't see much, but he can see that there are people that are brave enough or stupid enough to go closer to see what's going on. Some of these people are Ogilvy, Henderson, and Stent. Like a bunch of chumps, they're waving a white flag. Why would aliens know what that meant?
They do that in the 50s movie, too,
They
and
do.
I'm screaming at the screen, why are you doing that? But I think the hope is that the aliens will see we're signaling something. Like if I approach a dog and it growls, okay, that tracks. But if it pulls out a flag, okay, something different's going on here. And it doesn't really matter to me what's on the flag. So they're proceeding on the assumption that although monstrous, these Martians are obviously intelligent.
Sure.
And so they're waving the flag to show that we, too, can communicate.
Right.
About these red shirts with the flag, though, the narrator says, this was the deputation, and uses the capital D. I don't know if this is something they actually called themselves or if the narrator feels kind of the same way that you do and is being sarcastic. I suspect the latter, because these guys aren't long for this world.
No. 3 puffs of green smoke shoot out, followed by a bright flash and a hissing noise. An invisible ray is setting stuff on fire. The group with the white flag instantly burned up, and the beam moves around, setting everything on fire, including trees and houses in the distance. The narrator has a bit of a freak out and just can't move. The beam doesn't go all the way around the pit, because if it did, it would have burned up the narrator. Eventually, he gets his wits about him and he runs.
In so many of the adaptations of this book, there are visible laser rays hitting people because these are movies and they need to show it visually.
Yeah.
But what horror there is in the fact that this is an invisible thing. It's a lethal effect. You can't see the cause, just what it does. It was sweeping around swiftly and steadily, this flaming death, this invisible, inevitable sword of heat. It was as if each man were suddenly and momentarily turned to fire. Then, by the light of their own destruction, I saw them staggering and falling. By the light of their own destruction. Oh. Unfortunately, Wells is predicting what will befall so many of his countrymen and other people worldwide in the wars of the near future. Bombs dropping out of the sky, chemical warfare, invisible death that just can't be predicted. The narrator's freakout is totally relatable. I ran weeping silently, as a child might do.
On that jolly note, we get into Chapter 6, the heat ray on the Chobham Road. We learned that the heat ray burns anything combustible. It can melt lead, shatter glass, and turn water into steam. Scalding steam. About 40 people were killed near the pit, and many others were burned by the fire that was started by the rays. Some people were trampled, fleeing. So it's terrible. The narrator says that the heat ray uses a parabolic mirror, and that invisible light is concentrated into a beam. And that is what we now call a laser, which stands for light amplification by stimulated emission of radiation.
And the scientists who were actually creating lasers in the late 50s, again, acknowledged this book as an inspiration. Not the incinerating of people, but the technology ideas.
Yes.
What I was struck by in this chapter was the sense of motion. The last chapter was the heat ray, and this chapter is the heat ray in the Chobham Road. It's like it's advancing on you. The titles are moving the threat closer to you. I think we remarked on this in Dr. Moreau, how Wells is so good at starting the story spinning and keeping it in motion, sort of careening toward the middle of the book where he will hit the brakes suddenly, stop to speculate before hitting the gas again and driving off the cliff to the end. That's the Wellsian story structure, and it really works. He always keeps things in motion.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, just as the last chapter gave you a scare from the alien technology, this one gives you a scare from that very human reaction of a stampede, ending with, "They're coming," a woman shrieked, and incontinently everyone was turning and pushing at those behind. They must have bolted as blindly as a flock of sheep. Where the road grows narrow, a desperate struggle occurred. 3 persons at least, 2 women and a little boy, were crushed and trampled there and left to die amid the terror and the darkness. This panic motion continues into Chapter 7, How I Reached Home.
After running through the woods, the narrator collapses near a bridge. He rests and then continues, coming upon some people. He tries to talk with them, but since he's kind of a mess, they just think he's crazy. And they're totally unaware of the slaughter that's just happened. When he gets home, he tells his wife all about it, and she believes him. He reassures her that the Martians are slow and weak due to Earth's gravity being so much stronger than the gravity on Mars. He explains to us, the audience in the presence, that he didn't anticipate the rich oxygen in the environment strengthening them, or that their technology anticipated the gravity and efficiently compensated for that. At the time, he felt an artillery shell shot into the pit would just fix the problem.
Which is what most people think around him. He kind of ends up reassuring himself by reassuring his wife.
Yep.
They have done a foolish thing, he says, drinking some wine. I couldn't help but remember the weeks around the 9/11 attacks on New York when everybody was saying, they've woken a sleeping giant. And it was like this way to reassure ourselves. Oh, that was just a sucker punch.
Yeah.
We didn't see that one coming. That wasn't fair.
Yeah.
The other bit that really affected me in this chapter was the psychology in recovering from his earlier panic. He was running through the woods and crying and smacking into trees, and then he collapses and he stays still for a long time. When he gets up, he's suddenly better, like his mind has protected him in some way.
Perhaps I am a man of exceptional moods. I do not know how far my experience is common. At times I suffer from the strangest sense of detachment from myself and the world about me. I seem to watch it all from the outside, from somewhere inconceivably remote, out of time, out of space, out of the stress and tragedy of it all. This feeling was very strong upon me that night.
And that gets us into Chapter 8, Friday night. It's the following day and things seem to be just fine. People aren't aware of what's going on or just don't care. Almost all the witnesses are dead, and a few of the burn survivors are treated like they're crazy. Since Henderson was killed, the newspaper isn't getting any updates, and they don't take people's reports seriously. Anyone who goes to check out what the people are talking about just gets zapped. By the end of the day, a military regiment is sent to investigate.
He expresses the theme of this chapter right at the top, talking about the dovetailing of the commonplace habits of our social order with the first beginnings of the series of events that was to topple that social order headlong. I think it's called Friday Night because what does that call to mind? You know, the work week is over. Time to do something fun.
Yeah.
It's the evening of maximum careless thought. The military is at least starting to come alive to the seriousness of the threat, but everybody else is oblivious. Survivors of genocides, wars of aggression, you often hear the same thing. I couldn't have imagined that this was going to happen.
Right.
You know, our lives were normal. This wouldn't happen to us. And then almost overnight, it was just all gone.
The chapter ends with another cylinder landing just after midnight.
Well, maybe this is a cylinder filled with good aliens that'll help humanity out in return for, like, cool catchphrases and a pair of hot sunglasses. Maybe a makeover montage.
Yes.
Hello, second cylinder?
All right, let's see.
Oh, maybe.
Chapter 9, the fighting begins.
I was wrong!
Sorry. By Saturday morning, the military is able to surround the first crash site. The narrator goes down and talks to some of the soldiers, but they haven't seen any of the Martians yet. The narrator tells them what's up, but they argue with each other about how to handle the situation. The Martians haven't left the pit and are doing something down there.
What are they building in there? There's lots of hammering and smoke.
The narrator goes back home and soon after hears the sound of artillery fire on the second crash site. Then things kick off at the first site. Explosions and destruction are everywhere. Some of the houses near the narrator's house are destroyed. The narrator realizes his house is in range of the heat rays. He grabs his wife and servant, which, like all of these stories that we cover, there's a servant around that they never talk about. He goes to the local pub and he rents the local pub owner's horse and cart to get his stuff out of town to Leatherhead, where his cousin lives. They leave the burning area behind. It's amazing to me that this pub owner was still looking to make a buck when all this was happening, and he believed that the narrator would bring the horse and cart back.
The pub owner just couldn't be bothered with all of it because he was at work. There's confusion everywhere. Even though these rays are flying out all over the place, I think people in this situation aren't totally crazy to think that the battling will be confined to that pit. So why would he leave his place of business? How would they know what's next? In fact, the beginning of this chapter kind of shows another stage of adaptability in that people are pretty aware that there are Martians with ray beams nearby, but they're kind of like joking about it.
Yeah.
The neighbor says, hey, those insurance guys are going to lose a bundle, like chuckling about it.
Yeah.
I also love the scene where the narrator gets to talk to the soldiers because it's like every older guy's dream of getting to impress some younger guys. You know, he's seen the Martians, and they haven't. So suddenly he's really interesting to them. It's a great scene. And after he describes the Martians, there's this dialogue from one of the soldiers. Ain't they got any necks then? Said one of the soldiers abruptly, a little contemplative dark man smoking a pipe. I repeated my description. Octopuses, said he. That's what I calls them. Talk about fishes of men? Fighters of fish it is this time. Loved it. I wonder if Fighters of Fish was the alternative title for the book.
Oh, gosh.
Probably wouldn't have done as well. I'm sorry, The Fighters of Fish.
Yes, that gets us into chapter 10, In the Storm. The narrator and his wife and their servant travel 12 miles to Leatherhead. He leaves his wife and the servant with his cousin, and then he goes to take the horse and the cart back. What?
Yeah.
He's a better man than I am.
You know, I think his plan was always get my wife and valuables out of the situation and then go back and see what's what. I think it's reasonable still to think it would be confined to the pit. I mean, they're just flabby Big Trouble in Little China monsters. They can't even levitate like in that movie. The military's there. They're going to take care of the job. Speaking of which, he actually admits to having a bit of what he calls war fever.
Right.
Like,
he does.
he's not really sorry to return.
Yeah.
He hears an explosion and actually thinks, I hope that didn't kill all of the Martians.
Right.
Because I kind of want a peace.
Yeah.
They violated the homeland. So I get that.
Right. On his way back, he sees a third cylinder crash. It's just getting started. There's a sudden hailstorm and lightning crashes as it starts chucking it down. The narrator sees machines rise over the hill.
And this thing I saw, how can I describe it? A monstrous tripod, higher than many houses, striding over the young pine trees and smashing them aside in its career. A walking engine of glittering metal, striding now across the heather. Articulate ropes of steel dangling from it, and the clattering tumult of its passage mingling with the riot of the thunder. A flash, and it came out vividly, heeling over one way with 2 feet in the air, to vanish and reappear almost instantly as it seemed with the next flash, 100 yards nearer. Can you imagine a milking stool tilted and bowled violently along the ground? That was the impression those instant flashes gave. But instead of a milking stool, imagine it a great body of machinery on a tripod stand.
He can see them walking through the trees as a man walks through reeds.
We have tanks and planes and all sorts of war machines now, but these would be blowing the minds of 19th century readers, I think.
The narrator tries to turn the cart around, but the horse freaks out and flips the wagon over on itself, and it dies. He's able to hide as the Martian machines pass by. He heads home in the dark, only to find the dead body of the pub owner. See? You didn't really need to bring it back.
Oh, what he was going to do was very civilized. You know, he was going to make good on his promise.
Yeah.
But the death of this pub owner, I think, is a symbol to represent the end of civilization as the narrator knows it. Mm-hmm. It is kind of a silly thing that he was returning this horse and cart, but that represents that more innocent time. And now the narrator is returning to his own home, but the entire world around it has changed.
I let myself in with my latchkey, closed, locked, and bolted the door, staggered to the foot of the staircase, and sat down. My imagination was full of those striding metallic monsters, and of the dead body smashed against the fence. I crouched at the foot of the staircase with my back to the wall, shivering violently.
Whew. Well, that's the end of chapter 10, and a good place to stop as the narrator enters the upside-down world of the second act.
Wow.
Wells is so mathematical with his story structure. The other books were laid out like this, too, into very neat quarters. It's as if he knew we would be covering them over 4 weeks. Yet another prediction of the future.
Thanks to Greg Johnson for reading. Check him out on Patreon and YouTube. You won't be sorry. You'll be the opposite of sorry. Joyful? Proud?
You will be panicked with joy.
There you go.
He's finally starting that panic, but it's a positive one. I also want to thank our stakers. You know, we call out our lovely patrons in every episode of this show, but these are the generous supporters that make these free shows possible. Mm-hmm. And so we proclaim their names to the heavens every month in defiance of any alien overlords that may try to stop us. They are Dandelo, the new Wilhelm.
Welcome, Dandelo. Cryptocartographer.
Alistair Brooks.
I want to thank Prince Prawn.
The twins, thank you.
Christopher Rosser, thank you.
Thank you, Boss Coffee.
Eric Gordon, thank you.
Eric S. Vallone, MD, thank you so much.
Richard Wolf, thank you so much.
And Ben A., thank you. We're going to be back next week with the second quarter of The War of the Worlds. I hope you'll join us then. For now, I'm Chad Pfeiffer.
I'm Chris Lackey, and you've been listening to Strange Studies of Strange Stories
at strangestudies.com and Patreon.
Strange Studies of Strange Stories.